Welcome to Tales from the Trenches, Season 4. Today, it is my honor to have fellow Canadian Mike Duerksen with us.
Here's a story of a fundraiser who was launching his very own web show. Each episode is very short due to edits, so it can really flow. Here's a story of a podcast guest star who was busy raising money of their own. They were each great in their own way, fundraising in his own. Till the one day when Jack asked a guest to join him, and they knew it was much more than a jest, that these guests must somehow form a resource. That's the way they all became the podcast guests. The podcast guests. The podcast guests. That's the way they became the podcast guests.
Mike is the founder of BuildGood, a fundraising growth agency that helps nonprofits in Canada and the U.S. increase revenue from new and existing donors, with a special focus on improving the lifetime values from first-time giver to legacy leaver. He's also the host of the top-rated nonprofit podcast, the BuildGood Fundraising Podcast, and convener of the BuildGood Summit in Toronto, a 2-day showcase of fundraising innovation and inspiration that brings together 300-plus fundraising leaders. But his most important job is husband and dad to 3 kids. Outside of work, he loves spending time at the cabin with his family and reading biographies.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jack. Good to be here.
There's a great book by Charles Bronfman, another fellow Canadian, called The Art of Giving. And he says, there's certain gifts you have to give, right? When the next door neighbor is coming collecting for, the Cancer Society, like you don't want to be a heel, but it may not be your charity of choice. So he says there's a certain amount of money that you should set aside that are kind of those obligatory things.
Right.
And, he goes even greater, like the United Ways and some of the federations are under those exact same banners. But he says, set aside 80% of your money that you want to give away to transformational things, like things that matter to you, and be much more, thoughtful in your philanthropy. And do you see that? Like, I think it rings true.
Yeah, and I want to be clear that sometimes we mistake a channel for approach. So I think you can do direct mail very, very thoughtfully, in a way that honors people's connection to the cause, in a way that honors their identity. And I think you can use direct mail in a very, very transactional way. I think many of us are probably used to a more transactional approach when it comes to opening up our inbox, our mailbox. But that doesn't mean that it has to be that way. And we know that a lot of donors we're a big advocate for moving the relationship into a one-on-one situation, right? And not just keeping it arm's length. But we do know that a lot of donors don't want that. A lot of donors, there's all kinds of folks, right? Some people really like just giving through the mail, getting the quarterly updates, following along. Other people would love to go out for coffee with you, and would love to hear about what you've got going on. They would love to consider larger gifts every now and again when it makes a lot of sense, right? What makes all the difference is, as fundraisers, our willingness to listen. Because people will tell us those things if we listen. They'll tell us them through 2 different ways. Number one is through their actions. And when we look at our data, data is just a snapshot of people's actions, right? That's all it is. And the other one is actual conversations. It's just being in relationship with people and having conversations. Those conversations can be one-on-one. They can be one-to-few in focus studies, in focus groups, or they can be one-to-many in surveys. Each of those on their own is a very low resolution picture. If you're only looking at data, data will tell you what the data is. It will not tell you why the data is. only conversations can fill in the why, right? And conversations alone can tell you what people think they want, but it doesn't always tell you if that's actually how they're going to act later. So you got to hold both of those together, right? It's a bit of a Venn diagram where you got to hold both of those together, and that will give you a higher definition picture. But to your point, you'll only know that if you're listening. You'll only know what is meaningful, what is connection to cause, where people are at with your organization, if you start with a posture of listening.
Yeah. No, I think that's very sage advice. We were chatting earlier that I'm doing some consulting as well. And, I talk to some fundraisers and they say, our donors have donor fatigue, and that's why our donations are down. And I have a theory it's not fatigue. It's a lack of inspiration or a lack of something to that effect, right? So often all we do is, you take a look, you have a cohort, well, they gave this much last year, so let's add 5% and see if we can get that this year. And it's really not inspiring at all. It's very, very transactional.
Yeah.
The donors are afraid of saying, no, I don't want to give anymore, because they feel that sense of responsibility if they've been giving for 10, 15, 20 years, but they're tired of the same old. So it's not donor fatigue as in, they're tired of giving. They just haven't been inspired. They presumably have the same revenue and income, if not more, than they did in previous years.
Yeah, I haven't seen any research or any evidence that humans have evolved, biologically, to be less generous. I haven't seen any evidence that we have biologically evolved to have less generous hearts, and that we as a society are actually tired of being generous or tired of giving. However, I think it's not hard to look around and see and accept the fact that a lot of people might be tired of our tactics. They might not be any less generous than before. They might just be tired of our tactics, how they're being approached, what they're seeing. And so they might be becoming a little bit more discerning, or they might be giving in other ways that isn't showing up on the way that we measure generosity. The main way that we're measuring generosity is making a tax receivable gift to a charity, because those are the things that we can track. But we don't know what's happening between neighbors. We don't know what's happening with people renting Airbnbs for people in Ukraine when the war broke out. We don't know what's happening with just people helping other people out. We don't know what's happening with the GoFundMes and all the crowdfunding that then when people are hosting these fundraisers for people in their community. All that stuff is very hard to measure. And so when we just look at the data, we say, oh man, fewer Canadians are making gifts to charity. And it's a similar story in the US and the UK. That is true. Like those gifts, fewer of those are being registered. And the average gift has gone way up. So fewer people making higher gifts. That is tracking. We don't actually know if that means that fewer people are being generous. We have no idea. But we don't have any evidence that somehow humans have become less generous.
Right. Yeah. So you and I both are in the consulting world. And I often find that as I call them, boards and bosses tend to be kind of a stick in the cog of how things go. Because either they're looking at something way too much, or they're actually not looking at things that they should be looking at. So can you talk to that? It kind of what are boards and bosses? What should they be looking at that they really are not?
It's a great question. I want to start by saying that boards are often Warren Buffett always says show me what the incentive is, and I'll tell you how the person is going to act. And so he spent a large part of his career trying to figure out incentives. boards are often incentivized, and this is a neutral statement. I don't mean to say that this is good or bad. It's just the way that the structure is. Boards are often incentivized to essentially manage risk. Because charities are not owned by anybody. There is no private owner. And so if a charity ever gets sued, for example, or something goes terribly wrong, the people who are actually most liable is the volunteer board of directors. They have put their names to this, and they're going to say, we're going to steward this organization on a volunteer basis. And so they are often very risk averse, because if something goes wrong, they're putting their own name and reputation and sometimes money on the line. And so I think that structure, naturally speaking, just creates a lot of risk mitigation. And so and the same thing happens with CEOs of charities, because they're also not they're not private owners of this company like another CEO might be. They are just stewarding this organization for the public good, and they are often also a little bit in risk mitigation mode. So I have a lot of understanding for that. I think the big thing about fundraising that feels very scary for bosses and boards is how vulnerable you have to be. So a boss and a board may very well want to tell the entire world how innovative the organization is and how awesome they are, because that feels safe. It feels like we're building brand. We're telling people how good we are. They will trust how good we are. So that's like the safest thing we can do, is tell people that we're a very, very good organization. When a lot of fundraising is about, here's a need, we need help with this need. Can you help us fix it? And it's a vulnerable position to be in. You're standing open-handed in front of a peer. I'm not saying you're standing with your cap asking for money. You're standing open-handed to a peer and saying, can you come join this ride with us? You are good at making money. I'm good at fixing this big giant problem in the world. Together, we can actually do that, because it takes money to fix this problem. And that can be a pretty vulnerable space. And so I think there's a bit of a tension there. I would love for boards and CEOs to be asking the organization and their fundraisers, which is how open and honest and vulnerable are we being with our funders? How transparent are we being? How many conversations are we having where we're saying, we want to fix this. Here's a big vision. Can you help us get there? We're not there yet. We balance that out with all the progress we're making, of course. Of course, we're balancing that out with progress we're making. We want people to feel competent in their giving. We want them to feel autonomous. We want them to feel like they're connected and related to our organization. But we are trying to fix a big, giant problem in the world. And if we're not, we should just shut this whole thing down.
Well, Mike, this has been absolutely amazingly interesting. You certainly have the direct mail market, very, very well thought out. And I think that many of our listeners will really, really appreciate connecting. So if folks wanted to connect with you, how would they do that?
If they're podcast listeners, because they're listening to your podcast, they can find the BuildGood Fundraising Podcast, which is very focused on building a broad base of donors. We don't really get into major gifts. They can find me on LinkedIn. I try to be pretty active, so just look for Mike Duerksen, or they can go to buildgood.com, and there's all the information there.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Jack. I'm glad we were able to find time for this.